For 7 years, the Bradford estate had been the quietest house on the hill, not because of its soaring ceilings or its cold marble floors, because of the girl 7 years old, dark-eyed still as a held breath, who had never spoken a single word in her life. Not once. Not to anyone. Her mother had spent millions trying to reach her. The finest specialists, the most decorated therapists on 3 continents. Every one of them walked out the same way they walked in defeated and silent themselves. Then, a carpenter arrived to fix a staircase. No credentials, no method. Just sawdust on his boots, a worn toolbox, and something no specialist in the world had ever thought to bring into that house. What he carried, no one saw coming. The Bradford estate sat at the end of a private road, lined with oak trees, so old their branches had grown into each other overhead, forming a tunnel of dark wood and filtered light. Trevor Hayes drove through it on a Tuesday morning in October, his truck rattling over the uneven asphalt, a thermos of cold coffee wedged between the seats. He had been given the address by a staffing agency and told only that the client required discretion, that the work involved restoring original hardwood, a staircase, some interior paneling, and that he should expect the job to run 2 to 3 weeks. He had not been told about the girl. He noticed her within the first hour. He was crouched at the base of the staircase, running his hand along the bottom riser to assess the damage-warped wood. 2 balusters split clean through the kind of neglect that accumulates slowly, and then all at once when he felt it. The particular weight of being watched. He turned, and there she was, standing at the far end of the entrance hall, in a white dress, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, holding a stuffed rabbit by one ear. She didn't move when he looked at her. She didn't look away. Trevor nodded at her, the way he would nod at anyone. She didn't respond. She simply watched him with an expression he couldn't read. Not afraid. Not curious. Exactly something older than either of those things. He turned back to the staircase and kept working. It was Miranda who told him not unkindly when she brought him a glass of water around mid-morning. Miranda was a heavy-set woman in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back and the unhurried manner of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by the households of the wealthy. She had worked for Carolyn Bradford for over 10 years, she said, and she offered the information about Violet, the same way she offered the water, plainly without drama. The child had never spoken. Not as an infant, not as a toddler, not in the years since. Doctors had looked for physical causes and found none. Specialists had cycled through the house, some soft-voiced and patient, some clinical and precise, and every one of them had eventually run out of ideas. There had been a father, Miranda added, her voice dropping slightly, who had died in a car accident when Violet was 2. The child had been in the vehicle. Trevor held the glass and looked down the hall. Violet had not moved. She was still standing at the far end, still watching him, the rabbit hanging at her side. "Does she do that often?" he asked. "Just stand there." "She watches things that interest her," Miranda said. "She doesn't do it with everyone." Trevor handed back the glass and picked up his chisel. What he noticed over the following days, without meaning to look, without any particular intention, was the way Violet moved through the house. She was never where the activity was. She stayed at the edges and doorways on the landing above rooms where other people gathered. The house had a full household staff, and various professionals came and went, a tutor on Mondays, a speech therapist on Thursdays, and Violet endured all of it with the same stillness, the same careful distance. Except with Miranda. When Miranda was in the kitchen, Violet was on the stool at the kitchen island. When Miranda folded laundry in the sunroom, Violet sat on the window seat 3 feet away, drawing in a sketchbook. She never spoke to the older woman, never reached for her, never seemed to need anything specific. She simply chose to be near her, the way a person seeks shade without thinking about it. And Miranda, for her part, never tried to engage her, never lowered her voice to a careful therapeutic register, never crouched down to Violet's eye level with an encouraging expression. She simply moved through her work and let the child exist beside her. Trevor watched this without comment. He understood it in a way he could not have easily explained. His son Raymond was 6 years old. Slight for his age with his mother's eyes, and Trevor's habit of going quiet when things were difficult. Claire had died 3 years ago, an aneurysm sudden no warning, and for 8 months after Raymond had not spoken. Not a word. The doctors had called it a trauma response. Trevor had called it grief and waited. One morning, Raymond had come downstairs, sat across from his father at the breakfast table, and said he wanted pancakes. That was it. No transition, no explanation, just pancakes. Trevor had made them without saying anything about it. He thought about that now, watching Violet watch the room from her place in the doorway. He thought about how Raymond had needed not to be reached for, how the reaching itself had been the problem, all those careful hands extended in his direction, all those gentle voices asking how he was feeling, how the only thing that had ever worked was Trevor simply being in the room, doing ordinary things, not needing Raymond to be any different than he was. He thought about it, and then he picked up his sandpaper and kept working. The incident at Raymond's school happened on a Thursday, a conflict at recess. Nothing serious, but the school required a parent to come in, and Trevor had no one else. He brought Raymond to the estate that afternoon, settled him in the corner of the entrance hall with a canvas bag of wood scraps and half-finished figures, and went back to work on the upper banister. Raymond sat cross-legged on the floor and took out the piece he had been working on for 2 weeks, a small horse roughed out of a block of pine, still unfinished on one side. He was patient with his work in a way that surprised most adults who watched him. He did not rush. He did not look up when footsteps passed. Violet appeared in the doorway of the entrance hall 20 minutes after Raymond arrived. She stood there, the way she always stood, rooted and watchful, her weight evenly distributed, as if she had been standing in that spot for years. Raymond glanced up at her, then back down at the horse. He turned it over in his hands, examining the flank he hadn't finished yet. Then, without any ceremony, he held it out toward her. Not as an offering, exactly. More the way you might hold something out to show someone what you were looking at. Violet stared at the horse. She stared at it for a long time. Then she crossed the room. It was 12 steps, maybe 15. Trevor heard the soft fall of her footsteps and looked down from the landing. He watched his son sit perfectly still, arm extended, not pressing, not smiling encouragingly, just holding the thing out and waiting. He watched Violet stop in front of Raymond and take the horse from his hand. She turned it over the same way Raymond had, examining the unfinished side with her thumb. Then she looked at Raymond directly, and she nodded. One small, deliberate nod. In the kitchen doorway at the far end of the hall, Miranda stood with a dish towel in her hands. She had gone still the moment Violet began to cross the room. Now she stood watching the 2 children, Raymond, returning to his bag for another piece of wood. Violet sitting down cross-legged 2 feet away from him, still holding the horse, and something moved across Miranda's face that Trevor had not seen there before. It took him a moment to recognize it. She was smiling. Not the polite, practiced smile she wore for the household staff or the specialists who came through. Something smaller and realer than that. Something that looked like relief. Carolyn Bradford appeared at the top of the staircase that evening after the children had been separated for dinner and the house had settled back into its usual quiet. She was a tall woman, composed in the way that people are composed when composure has cost them something. She looked down at Trevor gathering his tools and said she would like a word. Her office was a room of pale walls and very little decoration, a desk, 2 chairs, a single photograph on the shelf that Trevor did not look at directly. Carolyn sat across from him with her hands folded and told him in a tone that was neither cruel nor warm that he was welcome to continue his work. The project wasn't finished. She had no complaint with the quality of what he'd done. "But I need you to understand something," she said. "Whatever happened this afternoon, that is not something we pursue. You don't encourage contact. You don't engage with her around the subject of language. You do your work, and you let the professionals handle the rest." Trevor looked at her. She held his gaze the way someone holds a position they are no longer entirely sure of. "Understood," he said. He picked up his toolbox and walked out. But standing in the cool air of the driveway listening to the oaks settle in the evening wind, he understood something else. Something he hadn't said out loud, and didn't need to. Raymond hadn't tried to fix anything either. He'd just held out a horse, and Violet had walked across the room on her own. The following weekend, a new specialist came. Trevor was not there for it. It was a Saturday, and he had Raymond home, but Miranda told him what had happened when he returned Monday morning. She told him quietly, standing in the kitchen doorway, with her arms crossed, not the way someone shares gossip, but the way someone reports damage. The specialist had driven in from out of state, a woman with an impressive list of credentials, and a method she described as attachment recalibration. She had sat with Violet for 3 hours. At some point during the session, she had decided that the stuffed rabbit, the one Violet carried everywhere, the one she held by the ear, the way other children hold a hand, was an obstacle. A crutch, the specialist had called it, something to be gently removed so that Violet would be encouraged to seek connection from people rather than objects. She had taken the rabbit. Violet had not eaten since Saturday afternoon. She had not left her room. The door was closed, and when Miranda knocked that morning and set a tray outside, it stayed there untouched. Trevor stood in the entrance hall with his toolbox at his feet and looked at the staircase he still had 3 days of work left on. Then he looked at the ceiling in the direction of Violet's room, which he could not see from where he stood. Carolyn appeared at the end of the hall. She looked like someone who had not slept, though everything about her dress and bearing worked hard to conceal it. "She'll be fine," Carolyn said, and it was impossible to tell if she was speaking to Trevor or to herself. "She needs time to adjust. Dr. Hartley has an excellent record." Trevor nodded and said nothing. "I also want to be clear," Carolyn continued, "that until Violet is settled again, I'd prefer she have minimal outside variables. That includes Raymond coming to the property." It was stated politely. It was not a request. Trevor worked alone that week. The staircase was finished by Wednesday. The wood restored the balusters, replaced the surface sanded smooth and sealed. He reported this to the project coordinator from the staffing agency, and was told there was additional work, built-in shelving in the second-floor library, some warped interior trim in the east hallway. He accepted. He told himself it was because the pay was fair and the job was straightforward. He didn't examine that reasoning too closely. By Thursday, he had moved his work upstairs. The library was a long room at the end of the hall, its shelves half filled with books that looked unread, its window facing the garden. Violet's room was 4 doors down. He could not see her door from where he worked, but he could hear occasionally the small sounds that meant she was moving around in there. A floorboard, the soft drag of something across carpet. He set up his tools and began working on the shelving. The library was quiet, except for the sounds he made, the pull of a measuring tape, the low scrape of a plane along a shelf edge, the occasional knock of wood on wood. He did not call out to her. He did not adjust his behavior in any direction. He simply worked, and after a while began to do what he often did. When he worked alone, he talked. Not to anyone, just the low, even narration that had been a habit since his first years as an apprentice, when his mentor had told him that talking through a job helped you catch mistakes before they happened. He talked about the shelf bracket he was fitting. He talked about the grain of the wood and why it mattered which direction you sanded. He talked about a library job he'd done 3 years ago, where the client had wanted floating shelves and plaster walls, and the number of anchors it had taken to make them safe. He wasn't performing. He wasn't projecting his voice toward the hallway. He was just working and talking the way he always did. He didn't hear her in the hallway. He only knew she was there when he caught the movement at the edge of his vision, a small figure in the library doorway, one hand on the frame, the stuffed rabbit back under her arm. Someone had returned it. Miranda, he guessed. Violet stood at the door and watched him work. Trevor kept his eyes on the shelf bracket, and kept talking something about the way old wood moves when humidity changes, how you have to account for it, or the joints will pull apart in winter. He kept his voice at the same level it had been when the hallway was empty. Nothing about the room changed. After a while, Violet came inside. She sat down on the floor near the window, not close to him, but not across the room either. She reached into the pocket of her cardigan and took out a small square of sandpaper. Trevor recognized it as the same grade he kept in his supply tin, and understood that Miranda must have slipped it under Violet's door sometime that morning, quietly the way she did everything. Violet pressed the sandpaper flat against the floorboard in front of her and began to move it back and forth in slow, deliberate strokes. The motion had no purpose. There was nothing that needed sanding. But she did it with the same focused attention she brought to everything her head bent her rabbit beside her knee. Trevor noted this for 1 second, and then looked back at his work. From the doorway behind Violet, Miranda appeared. She had been in the hallway for how long, Trevor couldn't say. She stood watching the girl on the floor, and then she walked to the low reading bench near the window, sat down without a word, and picked up a spare offcut from Trevor's pile. She turned it over in her hands, found a rough edge, and ran her thumb across it. Then she reached over and took a second piece of sandpaper from Trevor's supply tin on the floor, smoothed it over the offcut, and began to work it slowly. No one said anything. The library filled with the quiet, layered sound of 3 people doing the same small thing in the same room. That was on a Thursday. On Friday morning, Carolyn came to find him. She did not raise her voice. That made it worse somehow, the precision of her anger, the way it was held carefully between her words, like something she was afraid to set down. She had seen it. The staff had seen it. Someone had mentioned it, or she had come upstairs herself and looked through the door, Trevor didn't know which. What he knew was that she was standing in the library doorway, with her arms at her sides, and the look of a person whose last remaining boundary had been crossed without permission. "I told you," she said. "I was very clear with you. You told me not to engage her around language," Trevor said. "I haven't. You told me not to encourage contact. I didn't. She walked in here on her own. That's a distinction you've invented to justify what you wanted to do anyway." Trevor set down his plane. He turned to face her fully because she deserved that. "Mrs. Bradford," he said, "your daughter came out of her room for the first time in 5 days. She sat on the floor and moved a piece of sandpaper around for 40 minutes. Nobody asked her to. Nobody guided her. She just came." Something moved behind Carolyn's eyes. She looked away from him toward the window, toward the garden below, where the October light was going thin and gray. "You don't understand what's at stake," she said, and her voice had changed. The precision was still there, but something else had entered it. Something raw. Every time someone tries something and it fails, it costs her. It costs her more than you can see. I had a specialist who spent 8 months with Violet 8 months, and when she finally left, Violet didn't come out of her room for 2 weeks. 2 weeks. And before that, there was a program in Connecticut. And before that, she stopped herself. Her jaw tightened. Trevor waited. "The rabbit," she finally said. "Last weekend, I knew it was wrong. I knew it the moment Dr. Hartley picked it up, and I didn't stop it." Her voice had gone quiet in a way that had nothing to do with composure. Her father gave her that rabbit. She had it in the car with her. When they found her, she was still holding it. She looked back at Trevor. "I let a stranger take it from her hands because I didn't want to seem obstructive. Because I still believe every single time that the next person is going to be the one who knows what to do." The room was very still. "I don't know what to do," Carolyn said. It came out simply without drama, which made it land harder than anything else she'd said. "That's the truth of it. I have no idea what I'm doing." Trevor picked up his plane again, not to dismiss her, but because he thought she needed to not be looked at for a moment. "Neither do I," he said. "I'm just here to fix shelves." She almost smiled. It didn't quite reach her face, but it came close. She left without resolving anything. Trevor heard her heels on the hardwood all the way to the staircase. The envelope appeared on Carolyn's desk 4 days later. Miranda had written it by hand, which Trevor learned afterward from the housekeeper who'd seen it. 1 page. She placed it on the desk herself in the morning before Carolyn came down. When Carolyn found it and came looking for Miranda, the older woman was in the kitchen already in her coat. "I've been in this house for 11 years, Miranda said. She kept her hands in her coat pockets, her voice level. "I've watched that child be tested and measured and adjusted and redirected. I've watched her lose ground every time someone decided they knew better than she did what she needed." She looked at Carolyn steadily. "I can't watch it anymore. I'm sorry." Carolyn did not ask her to stay. Trevor thought later that she probably hadn't found the words in time. By afternoon, Miranda's room off the kitchen was empty. Violet stood in the doorway of it for a long time. That evening, just stood there, looking at the made bed, the cleared dresser, the absence of the things that had made the room Miranda's. Then she walked back down the hall to her own room, and the door clicked shut behind her. That night, the Bradford estate was the quietest it had ever been, and it was a different kind of quiet than before. Not the quiet of a child who had never spoken, but the quiet of a house that had finally run out of things to try. Trevor finished the library shelving on a Wednesday. He reported it to the staffing agency and was told the remaining interior trim in the east hallway would take another 4 or 5 days. He said he'd be there Thursday morning. He hung up and sat in his truck in his own driveway for a while, watching Raymond through the kitchen window, the boy at the table doing homework, his head bent his pencil, moving in slow, careful strokes. He thought about the Bradford house. He thought about the quiet it had settled into since Miranda left, a different kind of quiet than Violet's, more like the quiet of a thing that has stopped trying. He went inside and made dinner, and didn't think about it anymore that night. Before he left for the estate Thursday morning, he sent Miranda a text. He kept it short. "Coming in today. Thought you should know?" He wasn't sure why he sent it. He told himself it was courtesy. He put his phone in his pocket and drove. Carolyn was waiting for him. Not in her office, this time in the entrance hall, standing near the staircase. He had restored her hands loose at her sides. She was not composed in the usual way. She looked like someone who had been up since before dawn making a decision. "I want to ask you something," she said. "And I want you to answer me honestly, not carefully." Trevor set down his toolbox. "Do you think she can get better?" Carolyn asked. "Not recover. Not become normal. I mean better than this. Better than a house full of people she can't reach, and a door she won't come out from behind." Trevor considered the question the way he considered a piece of warped wood, not rushing to a conclusion, looking at it from more than one angle. "I think she already is better than that," he said. "I think she walked out of her room and across an entrance hall and took a horse out of a 6-year-old's hand. I think she sat on your library floor and sanded wood for 40 minutes because it made her feel like she was doing something alongside someone else." He looked at Carolyn steadily. "I think she can do more than that. But I don't think more specialists are how she gets there." Carolyn absorbed this without defending against it, which told Trevor something. "Then what?" she asked. He had thought about how to say this. He hadn't found a version that was entirely comfortable to deliver. "I think you need to be in the room with her," he said. "Not to fix anything. Not with a goal. Just in the room. Doing something ordinary. Letting her exist next to you, the way she existed next to Miranda." The name landed between them. Carolyn looked away briefly. "I don't know how to do that," she said. "I don't know how to be in a room with her without wanting something from it. Without hoping that this time she'll—" She stopped, started again. "I've been hoping for 7 years. Every single morning I think maybe today. And every evening I think maybe tomorrow. And it has made me—" She looked at her own hands. "It has made me very hard to be around, I think, even for her." Trevor picked up his toolbox. "Come upstairs," he said. She followed him to the library. He set up his tools at the east end of the room, where the trim work was waiting. He put 2 pieces of sandpaper on the window bench. He looked at Carolyn, who was standing near the door in a silk blouse that had not been designed for sitting on floors. She looked at the bench. She looked at the sandpaper. And then, without saying anything, she crossed the room and sat down. Trevor handed her an offcut from his pile. She took it. He went back to work. They stayed like that for 40 minutes, Trevor working on the trim. Carolyn sitting on the bench, running sandpaper across a block of pine. She had no particular reason to be smoothing. She didn't do it well. She pressed too hard at first, and then too lightly. But she kept doing it, and gradually the motion found a rhythm, and the room settled into the particular quality of silence that Trevor had come to associate with this house. At its best, not empty, but inhabited. Violet did not appear that morning. But the following morning, she did. She stood in the library doorway for a long time before she came in. Carolyn was on the bench again. Trevor had not asked her to come back. She had simply appeared when he arrived, already seated, already working on a new offcut. Violet looked at her mother on the bench, the way she looked at everything with that careful measuring stillness. Then she came inside and sat on the floor, near the window, not close to her mother, but not far, and she took out her sketchbook and began to draw. Carolyn did not look at the sketchbook. She did not ask what Violet was drawing. She looked at the block of wood in her hands and kept sanding. After a while, Violet moved, shifted across the floor a foot closer to the bench, then another foot. She stopped there and went back to drawing. Carolyn's hand slowed for just a moment on the sandpaper, then continued. Trevor worked on the trim and did not look at either of them. That was on a Friday. He called Raymond's after-school program and arranged for his son to come to the estate the following morning. Raymond arrived at 9 with his canvas bag. He was a self-contained child, especially in unfamiliar spaces. He took in the entrance hall with a sweep of his eyes, asked Trevor once where he should set up, and when Trevor pointed to the library, he went there without further questions. He chose a corner near the window, sat down cross-legged, and pulled out the piece he was working on. A new figure, smaller than the horse not yet identifiable. Violet appeared in the doorway within 15 minutes. She looked at Raymond, the way she'd looked at him the first time in the entrance hall, with the same total unguarded attention she reserved for things that genuinely interested her, her shoulder resting lightly against the doorframe. Raymond glanced up, registered her, and looked back down at his work. He picked up his small carving knife and continued working, turning the block, slowly shaving thin curls of pine onto the floor around him. Violet came inside and sat against the wall 4 feet from where Raymond was working. They stayed like that for a long time. Trevor was at the far end of the room, nearly done with the last section of trim, making himself peripheral. Carolyn sat on the bench. No one spoke. Then Raymond set down his knife. He turned the figure over in his hands, looking at it. When he spoke, his voice was even and quiet the way it always was, when he was thinking about something he didn't usually say out loud. When my mom died, Raymond said, I stopped talking. For a long time, he kept his eyes on the wood. It wasn't because I didn't want to. It was because I was scared that if I opened my mouth, it would all be real. He turned the figure one more time. Like talking was the thing that would make it true. The library was very still. Raymond looked up, then not urgently, just an ordinary glance across the space between them. Was it like that for you? He asked. Violet looked at him. Something shifted in her face, not dramatically, not the way it shifts in the moment before someone cries. More like the way light changes when a cloud moves, small and total. She reached into the pocket of her cardigan and took out the pencil she always carried. She looked around for something to draw on, and Raymond, without being asked, tore a page from the small notebook in his bag and held it out to her. She took it and set it on the floor in front of her. She drew slowly with the focused deliberateness she brought to everything. 2 figures small outlined, simply seated close together. Around them, radiating outward, she drew lines that broke and fractured the way glass looks after impact. The car was not labeled. It didn't need to be. and the smaller of the two figures, the one on the right, had no mouth. She turned the drawing around and pushed it across the floor to Raymond. He looked at it for a long time. Then he nodded once in the same way she had nodded at him the first day deliberate sufficient. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I get it." Carolyn had been watching from the bench. Trevor did not look at her directly, but in his peripheral vision, he saw her hand stop moving on the wood. Saw her look at her daughter, not with the focused, hoping attention she usually brought to watching Violet, but with something else. Something more open than that. Something that looked almost like seeing for the first time. What happened next was quiet. That was what Trevor remembered most afterward, how quiet it was. Violet picked up the drawing, folded it once, and put it back in her cardigan pocket. She looked at the folded paper in her pocket for a moment, her hand resting over it. Then she looked up, not at Raymond, not at Trevor, but at her mother. Carolyn met her eyes. Violet's mouth opened. It was effortful not in a physical way, but in the way that doing anything for the first time after years of not doing it is effortful. The way a door opens when the wood has swollen in its frame, not broken, just stiff from long disuse. "Scared," Violet said. Her voice was barely there, rough and small, like a sound that had been kept in a small space for a very long time. "I was so scared." Carolyn left the bench. She crossed the room the way Violet had crossed the entrance hall that first Thursday, not quickly, not hesitantly, just steadily, and she sat down on the floor in front of her daughter. She didn't say anything. She put her arms around Violet, and Violet, after the briefest stillness, leaned into her. The rabbit was pressed between them. The drawing crinkled in Violet's pocket. Raymond looked at Trevor. Trevor looked at his last section of trim. Neither of them moved. At the library door, appearing without sound, in the way she had always moved through the Bradford house, Miranda stood. She was in her coat, her bag at her feet. She had come as soon as Trevor's text reached her that morning, and had been waiting downstairs in the kitchen, where she'd made herself a cup of coffee, and sat at the table she'd sat at. For 11 years, not sure what she was waiting for, but unwilling to leave. When she'd heard Raymond's voice drift down from the hallway above, she had set down the cup and come up. She stood at the door and watched Carolyn on the floor, holding Violet. Watched it with the expression she'd had that first afternoon in the entrance hall, when Raymond held out the wooden horse, and Violet walked across the room. Relief, and something older than relief. Grief and gratitude occupying the same quiet space. She stayed long enough to see that it was real. Then she turned and walked back down the hall. Trevor heard her footsteps reach the staircase, then descend. The next morning, her resignation letter was gone from Carolyn's desk. No one mentioned it. Miranda moved back into her room off the kitchen, and the house simply resumed around her as if she had never left. The made bed was unmade again. The cleared dresser held her things again. Violet stood in the doorway of that room one more time and looked at all of it, the ordinary proof that Miranda was back, and then went to find her sketchbook. The work on the Bradford house was finished in early November. Trevor completed the last of the east hallway trim on a Thursday, packed his tools into his truck, and submitted his hours to the staffing agency. He drove home through the oak tree tunnel, with the windows down the cold air, carrying the smell of wet leaves and turned earth. Raymond was waiting for him at home with a drawing he'd done at school, a horse-colored brown, with an orange mane clearly influenced by the carved one he'd given away. Trevor taped it to the refrigerator. The following Saturday, Raymond asked if they were going to the Bradford house. Trevor said he didn't know. Raymond thought about this and said they should. Trevor called ahead, and Carolyn said, "Yes, please come." That became the pattern Saturdays irregularly, because it was never scheduled and didn't need to be. Trevor would do small things that needed doing around the property. Raymond would bring his bag. Violet would appear in the library or the garden or wherever they happened to be, and she would sit within the radius of their work the way she'd always done, drawing or sanding or simply watching. Sometimes she spoke a word, a phrase, never more than a few sentences at a time, and only when she had something she actually wanted to say. The rest of the time she was quiet, and no one treated the quiet as a problem. Carolyn changed in a way that was difficult to name precisely. She had not become warmer exactly or more expressive. She was still composed, still careful with language, still the kind of person who kept her feelings close to her chest. But she was present in a different way. She sat on the floor now sometimes. She kept an offcut on her desk, sanded smooth on one side, rough on the other, and turned it over in her hands when she was on calls. She had stopped looking at Violet like a problem that needed solving and started looking at her like a person she was getting to know. It was a small change. It was the only change that mattered. She made calls quietly to child trauma organizations. She asked questions and listened to answers, and then asked more questions. Eventually, she started funding things, not with the urgency of someone trying to fix a child, but with the patience of someone who had learned that presence matters more than intervention. Trevor got a call from one of the organizations the following spring, asking if he would be willing to speak to a group of parents. He said he wasn't a specialist. They said that was exactly why they were asking. He went. Several years passed, the way years do when they are full of ordinary, necessary things. Raymond grew and kept carving horses. First, then birds. Then more abstract forms that he gave to people without explaining what they were. Violet grew and kept drawing, and eventually her drawings became something she shared first with Raymond, then with Carolyn, then with a teacher at the small school she began attending, who recognized in them a kind of language as precise as any other. She was not cured. She was not a before and after story. She still reached for her pencil before she reached for words. She still went quiet for days at a time, and when she did, the people around her had learned to simply be nearby and wait. The waiting was no longer frantic. It no longer had a deadline. The last evening of this story found Trevor and Violet in the library. The shelves he had built were full now, not with the unread books they'd held before, but with Violet's sketchbooks, with Raymond's carvings, arranged along one edge, with the ordinary accumulation of a room that had been lived in. The window was open. The October air was the same as it had been the first morning Trevor had driven up the estate road, cool and carrying the smell of things releasing. Violet sat on the reading bench with her sketchbook open on her knees, drawing something Trevor couldn't see from where he sat. He was in the chair by the door, doing nothing in particular, a thing he had gotten better at over the years, sitting without a task, without an agenda. They didn't speak. The room held them both without requiring anything of either of them. Trevor looked at the shelves he had built, the joined corners, the clean lines, the way the wood had settled into the room, as if it had always been there. He thought about the staircase in the entrance hall, the balusters he'd replaced, the surface he'd sanded back to something worth preserving. He thought about how wood didn't fix itself. It just needed someone willing to work with what was already there. He had not come to this house to fix a child. He had come to fix a staircase. And somewhere along the way, without any particular intention, he had done the thing that all the specialists, with their careful methods and their impressive credentials, had not managed to do. He had simply shown up, done ordinary work, and made it possible for someone to feel safe enough to take a step on their own. The girl beside him turned a page in her sketchbook. The house was quiet. Not the quiet of before. Not the held breath stillness of a child who had sealed herself away from a world that kept trying to reach her. This was the quiet of a room where two people sat without needing anything from each other and found that was enough. It had always been enough. They just hadn't known it yet.